The roar of the crowd shakes the ancient stones of the Colosseum, a thunderous wave of excitement rolling through the stands. But today, the spectators aren't just cheering for the usual heroes. Their voices rise for someone unexpected. A woman stands in the arena, her armor glinting under the sun, her gaze steady. This isn't a scene from a modern reimagining of history. This really happened. In the heart of Rome, where power and tradition ruled, female gladiators stepped into the sand, defying every expectation of their time. Who were these women? How did they rise to fame in a world that tried to silence them? And what did it cost them to stand where no woman was supposed to? The story of Rome's female gladiators is one of defiance and daring, a tale buried under centuries of dust and dismissal. These women weren't just fighters, they were symbols of rebellion, challenging the rigid norms of a society that saw them as anything but equals. They trained like warriors, fought like champions, and earned the adoration of crowds. Yet for every cheer, there was a whisper of scorn. For every moment of glory, there was a price to pay. Their fame came with a shadow, a backlash that history has often overlooked. What did it take for a woman to survive in the arena, not just as a spectacle, but as a force to be reckoned with? This is a journey into the untold corners of ancient Rome, where the lines between hero and outcast blurred in the heat of battle. We'll uncover the lives of these remarkable women, from the thrill of their victories to the harsh realities they faced outside the arena. How did they navigate a world that celebrated their strength one moment and condemned it the next? What sacrifices did they make for a chance at glory? And why have their stories been so often forgotten? Get ready to step into the sandals of these fierce competitors, to see history through their eyes, and to discover the legacy they left behind, one that still echoes today. The arena awaits. Let's begin. The Roman Empire was a world of strict roles, where women were expected to be wives, mothers, and caretakers, not warriors. Yet, against all odds, a handful of women shattered those expectations by stepping into the arena as gladiators. These women, known as gladiatrices, didn't just fight for survival. They fought for something far more dangerous in ancient Rome: recognition. What drove a woman to pick up a sword and face the roar of the crowd? For some, it was desperation. Slavery, poverty, or debt could force a woman into the arena, where victory might mean freedom or at least a chance at a better life. Others were drawn by the allure of fame and fortune. Gladiators, even female ones, could become celebrities, their names chanted by adoring fans. And then there were those who simply craved the thrill of combat, the chance to prove themselves in a world that told them they didn't belong. Historical records about these women are frustratingly rare, but what remains tells a powerful story. Inscriptions and artwork from Pompeii depict female fighters locked in battle, their skill undeniable. The poet Juvenal even mocked wealthy women who trained as gladiators for sport, a sign that some from higher social classes were drawn to the arena's danger. But whether slave or aristocrat, these women faced the same brutal reality. The sand beneath their feet was unforgiving, and the crowd's favor could turn in an instant. Their presence in the arena wasn't just a spectacle, it was a rebellion. Rome was a society obsessed with order, where gender roles were rigidly enforced. Yet here were women, armed and armored, proving they could be just as fierce as any man. Some audiences loved them, thrilled by the novelty and skill of female combatants. Others were scandalized, seeing them as a threat to tradition. The backlash was fierce. Emperors like Septimius Severus eventually banned female gladiators altogether, not because they weren't skilled, but because their very existence challenged too many assumptions about power and gender. So how did they do it? How did these women carve out a space for themselves in such a hostile world? The answer lies in the contradictions of Rome itself. The empire was vast, its culture constantly shifting. In the provinces, women sometimes held more freedom than in the capital, and in the arena, where blood and spectacle ruled, the crowd cared more about a good fight than about who was delivering it. For a brief, shining moment, these women proved that strength had no gender. Their legacy is a reminder that even in the most rigid societies, cracks can form, and through them, the boldest souls can slip through. Emperor Nero, one of Rome's most infamous rulers, had a peculiar fascination with spectacle, and female gladiators became one of his most controversial obsessions. At a time when women in the arena were already pushing boundaries, Nero amplified their presence, turning them into centerpieces of his extravagant games. His motivations remain as debated as his legacy. Was it mere shock value, a way to scandalize the elite and thrill the masses, or was there something deeper, a twisted admiration for women who, like him, refused to play by Rome's rules? The games Nero hosted were unlike anything Rome had seen. He filled the arenas with elaborate performances, blending theater and combat, where female gladiators fought not just each other but sometimes even dwarves or exotic animals, all for the sake of novelty. These spectacles drew enormous crowds, making the gladiatrices instant celebrities. Yet this fame was double-edged. On one hand, Nero's patronage gave them visibility and a measure of protection. On the other, it tied their fate to his volatile whims. When the emperor cheered for them, the crowd followed, but when his favor shifted, so did public opinion. Historians still grapple with Nero's true intentions. Some argue he saw these women as pawns in his games of power, using their defiance to provoke traditionalists. Others suggest he may have envied their audacity, seeing in them a reflection of his own rebellious spirit. After all, Nero was an emperor who performed on stage, a role considered beneath his station. Perhaps he saw the gladiatrices as kindred outcasts, challenging a system that sought to control them both. But Nero's influence came at a steep price. The more he spotlighted female gladiators, the more they became targets of backlash. Senators and moralists accused them of corrupting Roman values, their very existence painted as a symptom of societal decay. And when Nero's reign collapsed in disgrace, so too did much of the tolerance for women in the arena. Later emperors, eager to distance themselves from his excesses, rolled back the freedoms he had flaunted. The gladiatrices, once celebrated, found themselves caught in the crossfire of political upheaval. Yet for a brief moment under Nero, these women reached heights no one thought possible. They weren't just fighters, they were symbols, their battles echoing far beyond the arena. In a society that demanded obedience, they chose defiance. And though their time in the sun was short, their legacy outlasted even the emperors who tried to erase them. The story of Nero and the gladiatrices isn't just about spectacle, it's about what happens when power, rebellion, and fame collide. And in that collision, history was made. The crowd's reaction to female gladiators was as unpredictable as the battles themselves. One moment, they'd be roaring in admiration as a woman disarmed her opponent with flawless technique. The next, they might jeer, hurling insults about her place in society. This wasn't just about the fight, it was about what these women represented. To some, they were proof that courage and strength knew no gender. To others, they were walking contradictions, defying the natural order Rome held sacred. Consider the graffiti found in Pompeii, scrawled on the walls of a tavern. It celebrates a gladiatrix named Amazonia, her name etched beside crude drawings of her victories. Yet in the same city, philosophers and poets wrote scathing critiques, calling women like her shameless or unnatural. Even the satirist Juvenal mocked female fighters, portraying them as spoiled aristocrats slumming it for thrills. The backlash wasn't just about morality, it was about fear. A woman wielding a sword in the arena was a living challenge to the idea that men alone controlled power and violence. But why such extremes? Rome was a society built on hierarchy, where every person had a prescribed role. Women were meant to be pillars of the household, not warriors drenched in sweat and sand. When female gladiators thrived, they exposed the fragility of those roles. Their very existence asked uncomfortable questions. If a woman could fight like a man, what else could she do? Could the empire's rigid social structure bend, or worse, break? The arena became a battleground for these tensions. Emperors knew the public's fascination with gladiatrices could be leveraged. A well-placed female fight might distract from political scandals or curry favor with the masses. Yet the same spectacle that thrilled could also backfire. Traditionalists saw these women as symptoms of decay, proof that Rome was losing its way. Even as crowds cheered, lawmakers worked to erase them. By the 3rd century, female gladiators had all but disappeared from official records, scrubbed from history by those who found their legacy too dangerous to preserve. Yet for all the condemnation, their impact lingered. They proved that fame could be won outside the confines of tradition, that skill could defy expectation. The duality of their reception, admiration and scorn, celebration and erasure, mirrors the contradictions of Rome itself. A civilization that prized innovation yet clung to tradition, that celebrated spectacle but feared what it might unleash. The story of these women isn't just about their fights in the arena. It's about the echoes of those fights in the hearts and minds of a society forever torn between progress and the past. The Ludus was a crucible of sweat, blood, and iron discipline, a place where ordinary people were forged into gladiators. For women who entered these training schools, the challenges were even steeper. They drilled alongside men, learning to wield the gladius with precision, mastering the trident's deadly arc, and enduring the relentless drills that left even the strongest fighters gasping. But their training wasn't just about physical endurance, it was a battle against prejudice at every turn. Imagine the scene, a dusty training yard at dawn, the air thick with the clang of steel and the shouts of Lannister, the trainers who pushed gladiators to their limits. Here, a female fighter might prove herself with every swing of her sword, only to face whispers from those who believed she didn't belong. Some trainers openly resented women in their ranks, dismissing them as novelties or worse, distractions. Others saw potential, honing their skills with the same ruthless focus as any male recruit. The disparity in treatment was stark. A man's mistakes might earn him a reprimand. A woman's could be met with ridicule or even violence. Yet within these harsh walls, bonds formed. Female gladiators often trained together, creating a sisterhood of survival. They shared strategies, patched each other's wounds, and whispered stories of those who'd come before them, women who'd fought their way to freedom or died trying. For enslaved gladiatrices, the Ludus was a prison with a singular hope. Victory could mean emancipation. A single palm frond, the symbol of a gladiator's release, might one day be tossed at their feet. But for every woman who earned her freedom, countless others perished anonymously in the sand. The choice to enter the arena wasn't always a choice at all. Many women were forced into the Ludus by circumstance, enslaved, sold to pay debts, or handed over by families desperate for coin. Yet others walked in willingly, drawn by the promise of glory or the slim chance to control their own destinies. The poet Martial wrote of a gladiatrix named Hermes, whose skill was so renowned she became a legend in her own time. But for every Hermes, there were dozens whose names vanished into history, their sacrifices unrecorded. Life in the Ludus was a paradox. It was a place of brutal oppression, yet also one where women could carve out fleeting moments of autonomy. They ate the same meager rations as men, slept in the same cramped quarters, and faced the same merciless grind. But in the arena, none of that mattered. When the crowd roared and the gates opened, all that stood between them and oblivion was their training, their courage, and the unshakable will to survive. The Ludus didn't just create fighters, it revealed who they truly were. And for the women who endured it, that revelation came at a price few could imagine. The fights female gladiators engaged in were as varied as the women themselves, each style a reflection of Rome's obsession with spectacle and its unease with women who wielded weapons. While male gladiators often fought in standardized pairings like the Mirmillo versus the Regimens, female combatants were frequently thrust into matches designed to shock and delight. Some fought in traditional one-on-one duels, their swords flashing as they traded blows with the precision of seasoned warriors. Others found themselves in chaotic group battles where survival depended as much on luck as skill. The crowd adored these variations, but beneath the entertainment lay a deeper truth. These women weren't just performers, they were fighters, their prowess undeniable even when the empire tried to frame them as mere curiosities. Weapons played a pivotal role in shaping their fights. Many gladiatrices trained with the classic gladius and shield, mirroring the equipment of their male counterparts. Yet others specialized in more exotic styles, wielding tridents and nets like the Regimens or dual daggers for lightning-fast strikes. These choices weren't always theirs. Promoters knew novelty sold tickets, so some women were forced into unconventional roles fighting dwarves, exotic beasts, or even each other in staged mythological reenactments. The poet Statius describes one such spectacle, where women dressed as Amazons battled in a choreographed drama meant to blur the line between theater and combat. The crowd cheered, but the message was clear. These fights were entertainment first, athleticism second. The stakes were no less deadly for being theatrical. A misstep with a trident could be fatal. A net tangled around an ankle might mean the end, yet the greatest risk wasn't the weapons, it was the crowd's fickle favor. Male gladiators could earn respect through sheer endurance, but female fighters often had to work twice as hard to prove themselves. Their matches were shorter, their victories downplayed. Some historians suggest referees intervened more frequently in women's bouts, as if to soften the brutality. But when the dust settled, the truth remained. These women spilled the same blood, endured the same pain, and faced the same mortality as any gladiator. What truly set their fights apart was the weight of expectation. Male gladiators were celebrated as embodiments of Roman virtue, strength, discipline, courage. Female fighters, they were contradictions, admired for their skill yet mocked for defying nature, praised for their bravery but whispered about in scandalized tones. Even their victories were framed differently. Where a man might be hailed as a hero, a woman was often labeled an anomaly. The arena became a mirror, reflecting Rome's deepest anxieties about power, gender, and the boundaries of tradition. Yet for all the constraints placed upon them, female gladiators found ways to transcend the spectacle. In Pompeii, graffiti immortalizes a match between two women, their names etched alongside the words "equal to men." In Rome, inscriptions tell of gladiatrices who earned their freedom through sheer tenacity. Their fights may have been staged as novelties, but their legacy was anything but trivial. They proved that the arena's sand could be a great equalizer, where skill, not gender, determined who walked away victorious. And in doing so, they forced Rome to confront a question it never quite answered. What happens when the spectacle becomes something real? The myth of the Amazons, those fierce warrior women from Greek legend, hung over the gladiatrices like a shadow. Rome couldn't resist comparing its female fighters to these mythical figures, a connection that thrilled audiences even as it distorted reality. On one hand, the Amazon label gave the women a kind of borrowed grandeur, elevating them to the status of legends, but it also reduced them to symbols, stripping away their humanity in favor of fantasy. The crowds didn't just see a woman with a sword, they saw Penthesilea reborn, a figure torn from epic poetry rather than flesh and blood. This comparison was more than just flattery. The Amazons represented everything Rome both feared and desired in women: untamed strength, independence, a refusal to bow to men. By linking gladiatrices to these myths, the empire tapped into deep cultural anxieties. Was a woman who fought like an Amazon still a woman at all? Or was she something else, something dangerous? The poet Ovid captured this tension perfectly when he described female gladiators as Amazons of the arena, a phrase that dripped with both awe and unease. Art and propaganda amplified the connection. Mosaics and frescoes portrayed female fighters with the same flowing hair and exposed limbs as their mythical counterparts, blurring the line between history and legend. Even their stage names leaned into the trope. Gladiatrices called Achilia or Amazonia weren't just branding themselves, they were playing into Rome's collective imagination. The crowd could cheer for an Amazon without confronting the reality of a woman who defied societal norms. It was safer to frame their prowess as something fantastical rather than acknowledge it as ordinary skill. But myths are double-edged swords. While the Amazon narrative granted female gladiators a measure of glamour, it also pigeonholed them. Male fighters were judged on their technique, their courage, their individual stories. Women, though, they were often reduced to archetypes, either noble warriors or monstrous aberrations. When a gladiatrix triumphed, some saw Hippolyta, the legendary Amazon queen. When she fell, whispers compared her to the Amazons' defeats, as if her loss proved women didn't belong in combat at all. The most telling irony: the real Amazons, if they existed at all, were said to live free of male rule. Yet Rome's gladiatrices were anything but free. Many were enslaved, forced into the arena for others' entertainment. The myth gave them a veneer of power, but the truth was far more complicated. Their battles weren't for glory or independence, they were for survival. And that's what makes the Amazon comparison so revealing. Rome could mythologize these women all it wanted, but it couldn't erase the grit and determination that made them real. The arena didn't need legends, it had something better: women who refused to be forgotten. For every sword swung in the arena, there was a ledger being balanced behind the scenes. The life of a female gladiator wasn't just about blood and sand, it was about cold, hard economics. Enslaved women stepped into the arena because it offered something rare in the ancient world: a sliver of hope. A single victory could mean the difference between chains and freedom, with some earning their emancipation through sheer skill. But freedom came at a brutal price. The Lanisti, the trainers and owners of gladiators, knew exactly what these women were worth. Every time a gladiatrix drew crowds, her value skyrocketed, filling pockets far beyond her own. Freeborn women who chose the arena faced a different calculation. In a society where marriage and domesticity were often the only paths to financial security, the Sands offered an alternative. Some were aristocrats chasing adrenaline, but others were ordinary women with few options. A successful fight could mean prize money, sponsorships from wealthy patrons, even property. Yet the risks were staggering. A single bad match could leave them injured, disfigured, or worse, with no safety net to catch them. The poet Juvenal sneered at these women, calling them reckless for trading their dignity for coin. But what he framed as vanity was often sheer necessity. Promoters saw gold in the novelty of female fighters. Tickets for their matches cost more, the stands packed with spectators hungry for something new. Merchants sold souvenirs, tiny clay figurines of gladiatrices, their armor gleaming with cheap paint. Betting rings thrived on their bouts, with odds shifting as unpredictably as the crowd's mood. But the real profits flowed upward to the men who owned the schools, the arenas, the contracts. The women who bled for the crowd's entertainment rarely saw more than scraps. The system was rigged from the start. Enslaved gladiatrices might win their freedom, but only after earning their owner many times their purchase price. Free women faced debts to trainers, cuts taken by promoters, and the ever-present threat of being forced into even riskier fights if they proved too popular. Even fame was a trap. The more celebrated a woman became, the more the empire sought to control her. Emperors like Domitian staged elaborate spectacles featuring female fighters, then turned around and taxed their earnings. The arena giveth, and the arena taketh away. Beneath the roar of the crowd, the truth was stark. These women were commodities. Their struggles were packaged as entertainment, their bodies bartered for profit. Yet within this brutal economy, they carved out moments of agency. A handful used their earnings to buy family members out of slavery. Others invested in businesses, proving that the skills learned in the arena, discipline, strategy, resilience, could translate beyond the sand. Their stories force us to ask who really profited from their fame. Was it the women who risked everything, or the empire that turned their defiance into just another line item in its ledgers? The answer, like so much in ancient Rome, is written in contradictions. The sand of the arena was often stained with the blood of women who never chose to be there. For enslaved female gladiators, the roar of the crowd wasn't a call to glory. It was the sound of a trap closing around them. These women weren't volunteers chasing fame or fortune. They were property bought and sold like weapons, their bodies pressed into service for someone else's profit. Their stories reveal the brutal underbelly of Rome's entertainment machine, where human lives were traded as casually as the bets placed on their fights. The journey into the arena typically began with a sale. Slave markets across the empire funneled women into gladiator schools, where physical strength and agility could turn a cheap purchase into a lucrative investment. Some had been captured in foreign wars, ripped from their homes and families. Others were born into slavery, their fate sealed before they could walk. Once branded as gladiators, they became assets, their value measured in ticket sales and gambling odds. A single skilled fighter could earn her owner enough to buy a small estate, assuming she survived long enough to repay the investment. Training was a relentless grind, designed to break as much as it built. Enslaved gladiatrices endured the same brutal regimens as men: hours of sword drills, endurance runs, and mock battles under the watchful eyes of trainers who cared more about their performance than their survival. But the risks were even higher for women. Injuries that might sideline a male gladiator could spell disaster for an enslaved woman, whose worth hinged on her ability to perform. A broken bone or disfiguring scar might mean being sold off to far worse fates: mines, brothels, or backbreaking agricultural labor. The arena, for all its dangers, was sometimes the kinder option. Yet even here, cruelty wore many faces. Some owners pushed their fighters to the brink, staging excessive matches to maximize profits. Others exploited their gladiatrices as status symbols, parading them at parties before wealthy patrons who saw the women as exotic curiosities. The poet Martial describes one such occasion where a host proudly displayed his female gladiators like prized hunting dogs. Their humanity was erased, their identities reduced to a single function: to fight, to bleed, to entertain. The promise of freedom dangled just out of reach. An enslaved gladiatrix could, in theory, earn her emancipation through exceptional performance. The wooden sword known as the rudis was sometimes granted to victorious gladiators, symbolizing their release. But these stories were the exception, not the rule. More often, freedom came with strings: continued service as a trainer, indentured loyalty to a patron, or the crushing weight of debts owed for years of care. And for every woman who won her rudis, countless others died anonymous deaths, their names forgotten by history. The bitterest irony, the very fame that could secure a gladiatrix's freedom also made her a target. A celebrated fighter was too valuable to simply release. Owners might grant nominal freedoms while retaining control over her earnings, her contracts, even her personal life. Some women found themselves trapped in a gilded cage, their hard-won autonomy an illusion. The crowd might cheer their victories, but the system ensured they never truly escaped. This was the paradox of the enslaved female gladiator. In the arena, she could command respect, even adoration, but outside it, she remained someone else's property. Her strength, her skill, her courage, none of it belonged to her. Rome's obsession with spectacle demanded these women perform miracles, only to remind them over and over that they were never meant to be free. Their legacy isn't just one of survival. It's a testament to the resilience of those who fought, not for glory, but for the faintest chance to reclaim their own lives. The mosaics of ancient Rome shimmer with fragments of a forgotten world, and among them, scattered like whispers, are the images of female gladiators. These artworks, sometimes bold, sometimes sly, offer the clearest window into how these women were seen and how they saw themselves. In Pompeii, a fresco shows two gladiatrices mid-combat, their muscular arms locked in struggle, their faces etched with determination. They're named Amazonia and Achilia, their identities preserved not in dusty scrolls but in vibrant color. Yet just down the road, another piece caricatures a female fighter, her exaggerated posture more punchline than tribute. This duality is the heart of their legacy, celebrated and scorned, immortalized and mocked all at once. Art was never just decoration in Rome, it was propaganda, social commentary, a mirror held up to the empire's contradictions. When female gladiators appeared in mosaics or pottery, they weren't merely being recorded, they were being interpreted. Some artists rendered them with the same reverence as male fighters, their armor detailed, their stances heroic. Others reduced them to grotesques, limbs contorted for laughs, their very presence a joke. This wasn't just about artistic style, it was about control. By framing these women as either marvels or monsters, artists shaped how the public understood them, reinforcing or undermining their place in society with every brushstroke. Take the famous Halicarnassus relief where a gladiatrix stands triumphant, her foot on the chest of a defeated opponent. She's not just a fighter, she's a symbol. The intricate carving mirrors depictions of male victors, suggesting equality in skill. Yet the inscription beneath her is oddly casual, calling her the girl who conquered. The tone is almost playful, as if her victory were charming rather than commanding. Even in triumph, she couldn't escape the condescension of a culture that struggled to take her seriously. Then there's the curious case of the Bikini Girls mosaic from Sicily. At first glance, it seems to show young women exercising in skimpy outfits until you notice the gladiator's helmet at their feet. Scholars still debate whether these figures were actual gladiatrices or performers parodying them. Either way, the message is clear: female strength was often framed as spectacle, something to be ogled rather than honored. The line between athlete and entertainment blurred, their bodies becoming canvases for Rome's anxieties about gender and power. Why preserve them in art but purge them from history books? The answer lies in Rome's uneasy relationship with their existence. Art could be dismissed as fantasy, as exaggeration. Official records carried weight. To inscribe female gladiators in marble or law would mean acknowledging their legitimacy, something the empire was never prepared to do. So they lingered in the margins, in tavern graffiti, in banquet hall decorations, in the private collections of wealthy patrons who found them thrilling or titillating. They were memory and erasure side by side. These artworks do more than document, they betray the tension at the heart of Roman society. The same hands that carved gladiatrices into stone also built the systems that suppressed them. The same eyes that admired their skill in mosaics averted their gaze when emperors banned them from the arena. Yet for all the contradictions, one truth emerges: these women refused to vanish. However fragmented their legacy, however ambivalent their portrayal, they left marks that even time couldn't scrub away. Every chipped tile, every faded fresco is a testament to their stubborn, indelible presence. By the 3rd century, the roar of the crowd for female gladiators had faded to silence. What was once a spectacle that captivated Rome became a relic, erased by a perfect storm of politics, economics, and moral panic. The decline wasn't sudden, it was a slow suffocation, as the empire tightened its grip on who could wield power, even in the arena. Emperor Septimius Severus's ban in the year 200 was less a single blow than the final nail in a coffin already being built. The reasons behind their disappearance were as layered as Roman society itself. On the surface, the ban was framed as a moral crusade. Severus and his advisors painted female fighters as corrupting influences, their presence in the arena a symptom of Rome's supposed decay. Senators nodded along, eager to blame societal ills on anything but their own failures. But dig deeper, and the truth gets murkier. Rome's elite had always been uneasy about women who challenged norms. As the empire faced external threats and internal instability, controlling gender roles became a way to project strength. The arena, once a space for subversion, was now a stage for enforcing tradition. Economics played just as big a role. Gladiatorial games were staggeringly expensive, funded by emperors and wealthy patrons to buy public favor. As Rome's coffers dwindled, so did the appetite for novelty acts. Female fighters, often billed as exotic attractions, required specialized training and costumes. When budgets tightened, they were the first cuts, deemed frivolous compared to the classic male matchups crowds still demanded. The poet Juvenal's old jabs about female gladiators being a waste of resources suddenly found sympathetic ears in a cash-strapped bureaucracy. Yet the most telling factor might have been the crowd itself. Over time, public taste shifted. The shock value of women in combat wore off, replaced by a craving for even wilder spectacles: exotic beasts, naval battles, elaborate executions. Gladiatrices became collateral in Rome's escalating hunger for extremes. Without the audience's fervor, they lost what little protection their fame had afforded. No cheers meant no profits, and no profits meant no place in the games. The ban didn't just erase female gladiators, it rewrote history. Later chroniclers downplayed their existence, framing them as a brief aberration rather than a decades-long tradition. By the time Christian writers took up their pens, gladiatrices were reduced to moral fables, cautionary tales about the dangers of women stepping out of line. Their real stories of skill, resilience, and defiance were buried under layers of disapproval. But here's the twist: Rome couldn't quite scrub them away. In the ruins of Pompeii, graffiti still shouts their names. In scattered mosaics, their images linger, frozen mid-strike. Their legacy is a reminder that even the mightiest empires can't fully control the stories they try to erase. The arena's sand may have been swept clean of female fighters, but the imprint of their footsteps remains faint but undeniable. The voices of female gladiators echo only in the margins of history, drowned out by the pens of men who wrote their stories for them. Roman historians and poets documented their fights, their scandals, their bodies, but rarely their thoughts. When the poet Statius describes a gladiatrix as fiercer than any lioness, we hear his awe, not hers. When Juvenal mocks wealthy women playing at combat, we catch his disdain, not their defiance. The silence is deafening. What would these women have said about the sand beneath their feet, the weight of a sword in their hands, the roar of a crowd that loved and loathed them in the same breath? Clues linger in the fragments they left behind. Graffiti in Pompeii scratches out the names of two fighters, Amazonia and Achilia, with the simple boast, equal to men. No flowery poetry, no moralizing, just a stark claim of parity. In Rome, a rare inscription honors a gladiatrix named Hermes, her victories carved in stone by someone who saw her as more than a spectacle. These fleeting marks feel like rebellion, tiny acts of defiance against a world determined to define them. Even the artwork tells a story. The hallucinaceous relief shows a female fighter standing tall over her opponent, her posture proud, her victory undeniable. The artist may not have known her name, but he captured something raw and real. A woman in control, if only for that moment. Yet for every artifact that hints at their perspective, 100 others distort it. Mosaics reduce them to exotic curiosities, their battles framed as titillation rather than skill. Satires paint them as spoiled aristocrats slumming it for thrills, erasing the enslaved women who fought for survival. Even the term gladiatrix itself is a modern invention. Rome called them ludia or femini, words that blurred the line between fighter and performer. The language of the time refused to grant them the same legitimacy as male gladiators, as if their sex made their swords less sharp. The greatest tragedy isn't just that their voices were silenced, it's how deliberately it was done. When Septimius Severus banned female gladiators, he didn't just remove them from the arena, he scrubbed them from the record. Later Christian writers, eager to frame Rome's past as decadent, turned them into cautionary tales. Their real struggles, the bruises earned in training, the camaraderie of the Ludus, the dizzying rush of a hard-won victory, were flattened into moral lessons. History, as always, was written by the winners, and in the battle over whose stories mattered, gladiatrices were never meant to prevail. But silence isn't emptiness. Between the lines of scornful poetry and the cracks in weathered mosaics, their presence pulses. We see it in the way their matches drew crowds too large to ignore, in the way emperors feared their influence enough to ban them, in the way their legacy outlasted even Rome itself. They may not have written their own histories, but they etched them into the world in other ways, with every swing of a sword, every defiant stance, every silent refusal to be forgotten. The sand has long since settled over their footprints, but the impression remains deep, undeniable, and waiting to be rediscovered. Steel clashed against steel, sand kicked up in clouds, and the roar of the crowd drowned out everything, even the screams. For female gladiators, every fight was a dance on the edge of a blade. The physical toll was relentless. Broken bones, slashed tendons, concussions, these weren't just risks, they were inevitabilities. Medical care in the Ludus was crude at best. Wounds were stitched with needle and thread, fractures set with rough hands, infections treated with little more than honey and hope. A twisted ankle or a deep gash could mean the difference between survival and being cast aside, no longer worth the cost of keeping alive. And yet they fought on, their bodies becoming maps of scars, each one a story of pain endured and overcome. But the wounds that never healed were the ones no one could see. Imagine stepping into the arena knowing the crowd's cheers could turn to jeers in an instant. For male gladiators, defeat might bring shame, but for women, it often meant something worse: whispers of weakness, of unnaturalness, as if their very presence was a gamble. The poet Martial wrote of one gladiatrix who fought with such ferocity that the crowd gasped in awe, only to later mock her for the sweat on her brow, the strain in her voice. The duality was exhausting, praised for strength one moment, punished for showing effort the next. Every match was a performance, not just of skill, but of navigating the audience's shifting expectations. Then there was the weight of mortality. Gladiators lived with death as a constant companion, but for women the stakes were layered. A man might die with honor, his name chanted as he fell. A woman's death was often framed as tragedy or titillation, sometimes both. Historians recount a match where two gladiatrices fought to a standstill, only for the crowd to demand their execution anyway. The emperor complied, not because they'd fought poorly, but because their struggle had moved the audience to cruelty. To survive, these women had to be more than skilled. They had to be unforgettable. A single misstep could mean oblivion, their names lost to time, their sacrifices erased. The emotional isolation cut deep. Many female gladiators were separated from families, whether by slavery or societal scorn. Even those who earned fame found themselves trapped in a paradox, adored by strangers, yet ostracized by their communities. A gladiatrix might be the toast of Rome one night, only to face sneers in the marketplace the next. The graffiti of Pompeii tells this story best. One scrawled message celebrates a woman's victory, while another, just beneath it, reduces her to a crude joke. They were legends and laughingstocks, often in the same breath. Yet within this crucible, something remarkable emerged: resilience. These women didn't just endure, they adapted. They learned to read crowds, to weaponize spectacle, to turn the very biases against them into tools for survival. A gladiatrix named Euphemia was said to play into the crowd's fascination, entering the arena in ornate armor that gleamed under the sun, distracting from the calculated precision of her strikes. Others, like the enslaved fighter Hermes, let their skill speak for itself, carving reputations so formidable that even emperors took notice. Their endurance wasn't just physical, it was a mastery of the mind, a refusal to be broken by a world that demanded everything and offered little in return. The legacy of their suffering isn't just a tally of wounds or a catalogue of losses. It's a testament to the price of defiance. Every scar, every silent night spent steeling themselves for the next fight, every moment of swallowing pride to survive, these were the hidden costs of their fame. They stepped into the arena knowing the sand might one day claim them, yet they stepped in all the same. And in that choice, they left a lesson etched deeper than any blade could cut. True strength isn't just about winning. It's about standing up when the world insists you kneel. To the people of Rome, the gods were never far away. There will whispered in the rustle of leaves, the flight of birds, even the outcome of a gladiator's fight. So when women stepped into the arena, swords in hand, many saw it as more than just rebellion. It was a cosmic disturbance, an affront to the divine order itself. Priests and augurs warned that female fighters invited misfortune, their presence twisting fate like a bad omen before battle. The historian Cassius Dio recounted how earthquakes and plagues were blamed on their existence, as if the very earth shuddered at the sight of armed women. Superstition became yet another weapon against them, sharper than any blade. Religious leaders were among their fiercest critics. The cult of Mars, god of war, saw gladiatorial combat as sacred, a ritual to honor courage and discipline. But female fighters, they were intruders in a male domain, their participation sacrilege. Temple oracles claimed their battles angered the gods, bringing famine or military defeat. Even the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most powerful priestesses, reportedly refused to attend games featuring women, as if their presence might taint the sacred flames they guarded. The message was clear: the arena was hallowed ground and gladiatrices were defiling it, but the fear went deeper than theology. Rome's foundation myths revolved around rigid gender roles: the warlike father, the nurturing mother. Female gladiators upended that balance, embodying a terrifying inversion of nature. Omens reinforced this anxiety. A surviving account from the 1st century describes a gladiatrix's match being halted when an owl flew overhead, its screech interpreted as Juno's disapproval. Another tells of a fighter whose helmet was struck by lightning mid-bout, seen as proof the gods demanded her removal. Whether coincidence or fabrication, these stories fueled the belief that women in armor invited divine wrath. Yet not all Romans bought into the hysteria. Some saw the hypocrisy. After all, this was a culture that worshipped Diana the huntress and Bellona, goddess of war. If women could be divine warriors in myth, why not in the arena? Cynics whispered that the priest's outrage had less to do with piety and more to do with power. By painting gladiatrices as harbingers of doom, religious elites could control what they feared: women who refused to kneel. The consequences were devastating. Superstition justified brutality. Female fighters were given the riskiest bouts, sent against beasts or outnumbered to appease the gods. When disasters struck, they became scapegoats. After a fire ravaged the Circus Maximus, rumors swirled that it was punishment for a recent women's match. No evidence linked the two, but logic rarely survives fear. In the end, religion and prejudice became inseparable. The arena was never just sport, it was a reflection of Rome's soul. And when that soul trembled at the sight of a woman with a sword, it revealed a truth far uglier than any omen. Sometimes the gods we blame are the fears we refuse to name. Roman law moved like shifting sand when it came to female gladiators, never solid, always changing beneath their feet. There was never a single sweeping decree that banned women from the arena outright. Instead, their legal status existed in a haze of contradictions, shaped less by clear statutes and more by the whims of emperors and the murmurs of scandalized senators. In the early days of the empire, the absence of explicit prohibition created an opening. Enterprising Lannister could acquire female fighters without technically breaking any laws, and ambitious women could step into the sand without immediate fear of arrest. But legal silence wasn't the same as acceptance. The first cracks appeared under Emperor Augustus, who passed sumptuary laws dictating who could sit where at public games, a seemingly unrelated rule that quietly reinforced hierarchies. By restricting elite women to the upper tiers, he sent a message: spectacle was for watching, not participating. Then came Tiberius, who banned daughters of senators from performing in the arena, not out of concern for their safety, but to preserve the dignity of their class. The message was clear: when women of status fought, it shamed Rome itself. Yet enslaved women remained fair game, their bodies treated as property to be traded for entertainment. Domitian's reign marked a turning point. He famously staged nighttime battles by torchlight featuring female gladiators, reveling in the spectacle. But even as he showcased them, he tightened control. New edicts required special imperial permission for women's matches, turning their appearances into political favors rather than routine events. This wasn't a ban, it was a leash. Gladiatrices became pawns in Domitian's propaganda, their presence a privilege he could grant or revoke on a whim. Surviving records from Pompeii hint at the consequences. One troop of female fighters abruptly cancels a scheduled appearance, their names scratched from the program. Were they reassigned, punished, the law's ambiguity left them vulnerable to unseen forces. the death knell came with Septimius Severus in the year 200. His outright ban framed female gladiators as moral pollutants, blaming them for everything from military defeats to poor harvests, but the law's language reveals deeper anxieties. It didn't just prohibit women from fighting, it barred them from imitating male virtues, a phrase that laid bare Rome's real fear, not the act itself, but what it represented. If a woman could wield a sword like a man, what else might she do? The legislation was less about preserving tradition than preventing a cultural reckoning. Yet even Severus's ban couldn't erase them completely. In distant provinces like Gaul and Asia Minor, local officials often turned a blind eye, their games operating beyond the capital's reach. Fragments of pottery from these regions still depict armed women mid-combat, their defiance preserved in clay. The law might have exiled them from Rome's grand amphitheaters, but it couldn't scrub them from history entirely. The legal saga of female gladiators mirrors Rome's own contradictions, an empire that prized order yet thrived on spectacle, that worshipped strength yet feared it in the wrong hands. Each shift in legislation wasn't just about controlling women, it was about controlling the idea of them, because as long as a gladiatrix could step into the arena, she proved that the lines Rome drew were never as solid as they seemed. The defiant spirit of Rome's female gladiators refuses to stay buried in the past. Centuries after their final battles, their legacy pulses through modern culture, reshaping how we see strength, gender, and resistance. From blockbuster films to academic debates, these women have become more than historical footnotes. They've evolved into icons, their stories weaponized and reclaimed in the fight for equality. But how much of what we celebrate today mirrors their true struggles? The answer lies somewhere between admiration and myth. Take Hollywood's obsession with gladiatrices. Films like The Arena and Pompeii paint them as sword-wielding rebels, their armor gleaming and their motives pure. These characters embody modern fantasies of empowerment, flawless, fearless, and untouched by the grime of history. Yet real female gladiators rarely had such clean arcs. Their battles weren't just against opponents, they fought exhaustion, exploitation, and the crushing weight of societal scorn. The silver screen smooths these edges, turning complex lives into crowd-pleasing heroics. Even Gladiator's brief nod to female fighters frames them as exotic anomalies rather than systemic challenges. Literature digs deeper. Novels like The Valiant by Leslie Livingston imagine the emotional toll of the arena, blending historical detail with visceral storytelling. Here, gladiatrices grapple with trauma alongside triumph, their humanity intact. Yet these fictionalized accounts walk a tightrope, how to honor their resilience without romanticizing the brutality they endured. Some authors, like Kate Quinn in Lady of the Eternal City, weave real historical figures into their plots, giving voice to women erased by ancient chroniclers. The result is a patchwork of fact and fiction, where the gaps in history are filled with modern empathy. Beyond entertainment, these women fuel contemporary debates. Feminist scholars cite them as early disruptors of patriarchal norms, their very existence a challenge to rigid gender binaries. Activists draw parallels between their battles and modern struggles: unequal pay, workplace discrimination, the right to bodily autonomy. The hashtag #Gladiatrix circulates during protests, a rallying cry linking past and present defiance, but critics argue this lens risks oversimplification. Ancient Rome wasn't a gender revolution. It was a system that commodified female strength even as it feared it. Celebrating gladiatrices as proto-feminists can erase the nuance of their oppression. Perhaps their most enduring influence is subtler, the way they force us to confront uncomfortable questions about spectacle and agency. today's female athletes, MMA fighters, boxers, wrestlers, still navigate audiences that fetishize their power while questioning their place. The roar of the Colosseum echoes in comment sections debating whether women belong in combat sports. The same society that cheers Ronda Rousey's knockouts once jeered gladiatrices for sweating too visibly. Parallels are uncanny, revealing how little some attitudes have shifted. Art keeps their memory alive in unexpected ways. Murals in Rio de Janeiro and Berlin reimagine gladiatrices as modern revolutionaries, their swords swapped for protest signs. Fashion designers drape models in gladiator-inspired armor, transforming survival gear into haute couture. Even video games like Assassin's Creed let players step into their sandals, blurring history and fantasy. Each reinterpretation adds layers to their mythos, but also risks diluting their truth. The real lesson of these women isn't just about breaking barriers, it's about the cost of doing so. They remind us that progress is messy, that defiance often comes with scars. Modern retellings may polish their stories, but the grit remains. They fought not for glory or ideology, but for the slimmest chance at control. And in that, their legacy is timeless. Whether on a movie screen or a protest banner, their defiance still challenges us to ask who gets to be heroic and on whose terms. The arena may be gone, but the battle over their memory, that's far from over. Bones don't lie. In a quiet corner of London's Southwark neighborhood, archaeologists unearthed a skeleton that rewrote history, a woman buried with the telltale marks of a gladiator's life. Her arms bore the muscular scars of years wielding heavy weapons. A brutal injury to her skull suggested a violent end, perhaps in the arena itself. But what stunned researchers most was the lavish burial, fine pottery, oil lamps, even the remains of a grand feast. This was no ordinary grave. This was a send-off fit for a champion. Dubbed the Gladiator Girl, her remains became smoking gun evidence that women didn't just fight in Rome's games, they were celebrated. This discovery shattered decades of academic skepticism. For years, historians dismissed accounts of female gladiators as exaggeration or satire. Then came the flood of physical proof. In Ostia, Rome's ancient port, a mosaic depicts two women mid-combat, their names Amazonia and Achilia, etched proudly beside them. In Turkey, a relief carving shows a gladiatrix standing victorious, her foot on a defeated foe's chest. Even the soil of Britain yielded clues. A bronze figurine of a kneeling woman, sword raised, found near Hadrian's Wall. These aren't just artifacts, they're rebuttals to anyone who claimed these women were mere myths. The science behind these finds is just as compelling. Isotope analysis on the London skeleton revealed she likely grew up in Roman Britain, not Italy, proof that gladiator schools recruited far beyond the empire's heartland. Forensic reconstructions of her injuries show healed fractures alongside fresh wounds, painting a life of relentless training punctuated by brutal combat. And then there's the mystery of her missing grave goods. Unlike male gladiators buried with helmets or shields, her grave held jewelry and an ornate lamp. Was this a nod to her femininity or a reminder that even in death she defied categorization? Every excavation unearths new questions. Why do so many female gladiator remains appear in cosmopolitan hubs like London or Ephesus, not Rome itself? Did provincial arenas offer more freedom, or were these women exported like prized athletes? A recently deciphered wax tablet from Pompeii hints at answer. It records the sale of a female fighter to a traveling troupe, her price triple that of male recruits. Novelty, it seems, came at a premium. The most tantalizing clues might still lie buried. In 2018, ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies beneath Rome's Colosseum, possible training chambers where gladiatrices once prepared for battle. Meanwhile, newly developed imaging techniques could soon reveal faded inscriptions on ancient pottery, perhaps naming more fighters lost to time. Archaeology's greatest gift isn't just confirming these women existed, it's restoring their individuality. Each bone, each artifact chips away at the monolith of female gladiators to reveal real women who bled, triumphed, and left their mark on history, one sword stroke at a time. What makes these discoveries so electrifying isn't just the proof they provide, but the doors they open. Every shovel of dirt turned could unearth another Achillia, another gladiator girl waiting to tell her story. And with each one, the past becomes less settled, more alive, a reminder that history isn't set in stone, but written in sand, ready to shift with the next gust of wind. The grand festivals of Rome were a whirlwind of color, noise, and spectacle, a chance for the empire to flaunt its power and distract the masses with awe-inspiring displays. And among the chariot races, theatrical performances, and exotic animal hunts, female gladiators carved out their own space in the chaos. These events, like the Floralia or the Ludi Romani, were more than just entertainment. They were carefully choreographed propaganda, where every fight, every cheer, every gasp from the crowd served a purpose. When women stepped into the sand during these celebrations, they weren't just fighters. They were symbols, their presence a calculated blend of shock and allure. Take the Floralia, the spring festival honoring Flora, goddess of flowers and fertility. By day, the streets bloomed with revelry and feasting. By night, the games took a raucous turn with torchlit spectacles that pushed boundaries. Female gladiators became central to this atmosphere of controlled transgression. Their matches were billed as exotic additions, a break from tradition that thrilled audiences craving novelty. Yet the framing mattered. Organizers often paired women against dwarves or wild animals rather than male gladiators, ensuring their battles felt like playful deviations rather than legitimate sport. The crowd might cheer, but the underlying message was clear. This wasn't real combat, just a fleeting indulgence before returning to the established order. The Ludi Romani, Rome's oldest and most prestigious festival, took a different approach. Here, female fighters were sometimes integrated into grand reenactments of mythological battles, cast as Amazons or warrior queens. These roles gave them a veneer of respectability after all. Who could object to women playing mythical heroes? But the subtext was unmistakable. By casting them as legends rather than ordinary fighters, the empire reinforced the idea that armed women belonged to the realm of fantasy, not reality. When the festival ended, so too did the suspension of disbelief. The gladiatrices who had been celebrated as Penthesilea one day might find themselves mocked as curiosities the next. Public perception swung like a pendulum during these events. For some spectators, seeing women fight was liberating, a thrilling subversion of norms. Graffiti from Pompeii's taverns shows bets placed on female matches alongside crude sketches of their victories, proof that they had genuine fans. Yet others recoiled, their discomfort etched into surviving letters and satires. The philosopher Seneca wrote of leaving a festival in disgust when women entered the arena, calling their participation a sign of the time's decay. This duality was by design. Festivals allowed Rome to indulge its fascination with female fighters while keeping them at arm's length, admired but never fully accepted, celebrated but never equal. The tension between spectacle and stigma reached its peak during imperial birthdays or military triumphs, when emperors used gladiatrices as political tools. Caligula famously staged a women's bout to celebrate his sister's birthday, a move that scandalized the Senate but delighted the masses. The message was transparent. Even the most rigid traditions could bend to imperial whim. Yet these exceptions proved the rule. Female gladiators were trotted out to signal the emperor's boldness, then hastily tucked away when the political winds shifted. Their role in festivals wasn't just entertainment, it was a barometer of Rome's comfort with defiance. What makes these festivals so revealing is what they omitted. No records describe female gladiators receiving the laurel wreaths or palm fronds given to male victors. No inscriptions list their win counts alongside men's. Their participation was often recorded as an afterthought, if at all. The very events that showcased them also erased them, reducing their struggles to fleeting amusement. Yet in the echoes of the crowd's cheers, in the fragments of pottery depicting their fights, their impact lingers. These women didn't just perform for Rome's festivals, they exposed the contradictions at its heart. A society that worshipped goddesses of war but feared armed women, that craved novelty but clung to tradition, that could applaud a gladiatrix one moment and dismiss her the next. The arena's sand may have been swept clean, but the footprints of their defiance remain. The armor of a female gladiator was a paradox forged in steel and leather, protection and performance, defiance and display. Unlike the standardized helmets and greaves of male fighters, gladiatrices often wore modified gear that played to the crowd's fascination. Some sported breastplates molded to the body, their silhouettes unmistakably feminine beneath the battle-worn metal. Others fought bare-armed, their tunics cinched at the waist, a deliberate nod to traditional Roman ideals of beauty even as they shattered them. This wasn't just practical attire, it was theater, a visual negotiation between warrior and woman that kept audiences riveted. Consider the iconic image from the Halicarnassus relief, a gladiatrix in a loincloth and greaves, her torso wrapped in fabric rather than plated armor. Her bare midriff and exposed limbs would have been unthinkable for a male gladiator, whose protection prioritized function over form. Yet her stance is pure combat, knee bent, sword ready, every muscle taut. The effect is jarring even today. She's simultaneously vulnerable and lethal, a walking contradiction that forced Rome to confront its own hypocrisy. How could a society that prized female modesty cheer for a woman clad in little more than straps and determination? The answer lies in spectacle's alchemy. Promoters knew that novelty sold tickets, and nothing fascinated like a woman armed but not fully armored. Some gladiatrices fought in tunics reminiscent of Amazonian legends, their outfits blurring history and myth. Others wore scaled-down versions of male gear, lightweight helmets with intricate filigree, shin guards engraved with floral motifs. Even their weapons were sometimes embellished, hilts inlaid with ivory or bronze. These details weren't accidents. They signaled that these women were exceptions, their violence made palatable by a veneer of artistry. But make no mistake, this was still armor, still designed to deflect blows and survive the sand. Excavations in Londinium uncovered fragments of a female gladiator's leather arm guard, its stitching reinforced at the joints. The wear patterns tell a story of relentless training, of a body conditioned to move swiftly under weight. Yet the same piece bears traces of gold leaf, proof that even utilitarian gear carried a whisper of showmanship. Every choice, from the thickness of a belt to the drape of a tunic, balanced survival against expectation. The most telling detail, what they lacked. Male gladiators often wore heavy manicky arm wrappings to shield against slashes. Female fighters rarely did, leaving their limbs exposed to heightened drama. The risk was calculated. A bleeding arm drew gasps, a near miss thrilled the crowd. Their attire wasn't just about protection, it was about walking the knife's edge between victory and vulnerability, ensuring every fight felt perilous, every triumph miraculous. This duality extended beyond the arena. A gladiatrix's armor was her identity, the only thing separating her from the nameless masses. In a world that denied women citizenship, property, even basic autonomy, that gear became a second skin, a tangible claim to personhood. When she strapped on her greaves, she wasn't just preparing for battle, she was asserting her right to exist on her own terms. The crowd might see costume, but she felt the weight of something far heavier. The chance to be remembered not as someone's daughter or wife, but as herself. A fighter, a force, a woman who refused to disappear. The roar of the crowd wasn't just noise, it was a weapon. For female gladiators, every cheer carried an edge, every jeer a calculated blow. The arena wasn't merely a physical battleground. It was a psychological minefield where perception could be as deadly as any sword. Male fighters earned respect through brute strength or endurance, but women had to wage a different war. One fought in the minds of spectators who couldn't decide whether to adore or despise them. Survival demanded more than skill with a blade. It required mastering the art of performance, turning the crowd's biases into tools for control. Take the way they entered the arena. Male gladiators often strode in with stoic arrogance, letting their reputation precede them. Women, though many opted for theatrical flair, some paused at the gates, letting anticipation build as they adjusted their armor with deliberate slowness. Others made eye contact with sections of the crowd, forging instant alliances with supporters before the fight even began. These weren't random gestures, they were tactics carefully crafted to disarm skepticism. A gladiatrix named Valeria was said to toss her helmet to a child in the front row before combat, a move that transformed skeptics into allies in seconds. The crowd didn't just watch her, they rooted for her. Then there was the fight itself. Male gladiators could rely on sheer aggression to win approval, but women had to balance brutality with finesse. A slash too vicious might draw gasps of disgust. A dodge too graceful could be mocked as fragile. The most successful gladiatrices learned to read the audience like a script, adjusting their style in real time. If the crowd grew restless, they'd escalate with a dramatic flourish, a spinning kick, a daring disarm. If murmurs of disapproval spread, they'd shift to technical precision, proving their skill was undeniable. The poet Martial described one such fighter who, sensing the crowd's hesitation, deliberately prolonged a bout with intricate parries until the spectators were breathless with admiration. By the end, even the doubters were on their feet, but the real psychological warfare began after the swords were sheathed. Male victors could bask in uncomplicated glory, but female fighters faced a labyrinth of expectations. Too humble, and they'd be dismissed as timid. Too proud, and they'd be labeled arrogant. Some gladiatrices navigated this by playing into Roman ideals of femininity, offering flowers to the crowd or dedicating victories to goddesses like Diana. Others leaned into their outsider status, adopting stage names like Furia or Bellona to frame themselves as forces of nature rather than mere women. The goal was always the same: to shape the narrative before it could be used against them. The stakes of this mental game were life and death. A male gladiator might earn mercy from the crowd with a show of stoicism. A woman had to work twice as hard for the same grace. Accounts from Pompeii describe a match where a gladiatrix, wounded and disarmed, tore off her helmet and knelt not in submission but in silent defiance. The crowd, expecting tears or pleas, was so stunned by her composure that they demanded her survival. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, turning vulnerability into strength, forcing the audience to confront their own prejudices. What made these women truly formidable wasn't just their ability to fight. It was their understanding that the arena was a stage, and perception was the most dangerous opponent of all. They didn't just wield swords, they wielded symbolism, weaponizing the very stereotypes meant to constrain them. Every smirk, every calculated pause, every choice to lean into or reject expectations was a move in a game far subtler than combat. And in that game, the greatest victory wasn't walking out of the arena alive, it was leaving the crowd forever changed by what they'd witnessed. The defiant footsteps of Rome's female gladiators echo far beyond the crumbling walls of the Colosseum. Today, their stories have been reclaimed as rallying cries in the fight for gender equality, ancient blueprints for modern resistance. Feminists point to these women as early disruptors of patriarchal systems, their swords slicing through the fabric of a society determined to keep them confined. But this isn't just about celebrating their strength, it's about recognizing how little some battles have changed. When a gladiatrix raised her weapon in the arena, she wasn't just fighting an opponent, she was challenging an entire world order. 2,000 years later, that defiance still resonates. Consider the parallels. Just as modern women navigate workplaces built for men, female gladiators mastered arenas designed without them in mind. They adapted to rigged systems, shorter fights, exaggerated costumes, condescending commentary while still outperforming expectations. Their victories weren't just personal, they were collective proof that capability knows no gender. Activists today draw direct lines between these ancient struggles and contemporary fights, equal pay debates echoing the wage gaps between male and female fighters, or the scrutiny faced by female athletes still judged for their appearance over their skill. The poet Juvenal's sneering description of a gladiatrix's sweaty brow could easily be a modern tweet critiquing a tennis star's ponytail, yet reclaiming their legacy isn't without controversy. Some scholars argue that framing gladiatrices as feminist icons risks sanitizing their reality. These women weren't volunteers fighting for a cause. Many were enslaved, exploited, or coerced into combat. Their resistance was often survival, not ideology, but others counter that oppression doesn't negate inspiration. Enslaved women who turned the arena's brutality into a platform for agency embody a radical truth. Even within chains, defiance takes root. Their stories remind us that resistance isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's the only path forward. The symbolism thrives in modern protests. At women's marches, signs proclaiming, "We are the daughters of the gladiators you couldn't silence," blend history with fury. Martial arts studios named after legendary gladiatrices train new generations to channel their strength. Even pop culture leans into the connection. Beyoncé's Formation video, with its armored dancers and unapologetic swagger, drips with gladiator imagery repurposed for black feminism. These nods aren't accidental, they're deliberate threads tying past battles to present ones, but perhaps their greatest lesson lies in the backlash they faced. Rome's elite didn't fear female gladiators because they were unnatural. They feared them because they revealed how flimsy the concept of natural really was. When a woman proved she could fight as well as any man, it exposed the arbitrary nature of gender roles. That revelation still terrifies patriarchal systems today. The same voices that called gladiatrices shameless now label assertive women aggressive. The arena's sand may be gone, but the playbook for silencing disruptive women remains eerily familiar. Their legacy isn't a neat parable of triumph. It's messier, richer, a testament to how progress is never linear. Some gladiatrices won freedom, others died nameless. Some were celebrated, others scrubbed from records, yet their very existence cracks open a vital truth. Oppression has never been absolute. Even in history's darkest corners, women have carved out spaces to resist, to excel, to be seen. And that's why their stories matter now. Not because they won every fight, but because they stepped into the arena at all, knowing the odds, the cost, and the power of a single defiant act to ripple across centuries. The battles may look different today, but the weight of their swords still lingers in every woman who refuses to stay where the world tells her she belongs. When two women stepped into the arena to face each other, the air crackled with a different kind of tension, one laced with spectacle, scandal, and the empire's deepest contradictions. These matches weren't just fights, they were theater, carefully staged to thrill and unsettle in equal measure. Promoters billed them as exotic rarities, their posters dripping with suggestive language that turned combat into voyeurism. A clash of Amazons, one advertisement boasted, while another promised the fury of Venus unleashed. The crowd flocked, not just for the skill on display, but for the forbidden thrill of watching women wield violence against one another. It was entertainment with an edge, designed to provoke as much as it entertained. Beneath the pageantry lay a darker truth. These bouts were exploitation dressed as novelty. Unlike male gladiators, whose matches were often framed as tests of martial virtue, female fighters were reduced to caricatures. Some were forced to fight in revealing armor, their outfits emphasizing femininity even as their swords slashed. Others were paired in ways that played into Roman fantasy's mythological reenactments, where they portrayed warring goddesses or jealous lovers. The poet Martial captures this voyeurism in a cringe-worthy verse, describing a match where two women fought like men but wept like women, a line that reveals more about audience expectations than the fighters themselves. The crowd didn't just want victory, they wanted drama, a performance that confirmed their biases even as it defied them. The backlash was swift and hypocritical. Senators who happily bet on male blood sports decried women's matches as degenerate, while moralists like Seneca tutted about the erosion of virtue. Yet their outrage rang hollow. The same elites who condemned these fights often attended them, their disapproval a thin veil for fascination. Even emperors were complicit. Domitian staged elaborate female bouts at private banquets, shielding his guests from public scrutiny while indulging their appetite for scandal. The hypocrisy was staggering. Rome reveled in the spectacle it claimed to despise, punishing the women who provided it. What made these fights truly controversial wasn't just the objectification, it was what they revealed about power. When men fought, it was a celebration of Roman might. When women fought, it became a subversion, a threat to the natural order. The crowd's discomfort simmered beneath their cheers. A surviving diary from Pompeii recounts a match where two enslaved gladiatrices, sisters sold into the arena together, were pitted against each other. The writer marvels at their skill but can't resist adding, how unnatural to see kin spill kin's blood. The unspoken question hung heavy. If women could be this ruthless, what else were they capable of? The exploitation extended beyond the arena walls. Betting rings thrived on these matches, with odds skewed to maximize profit rather than fairness. A papyrus ledger from Ostia details how promoters rigged female fights to ensure underdogs won, manipulating outcomes to squeeze more coin from the crowd. The fighters, already stripped of agency, became pawns in a rigged game. And when the sand settled, the women who survived faced a double bind, celebrated as curiosities yet denied the respect accorded to male victors. No statues honored their triumphs, no chronicles recorded their techniques. They were vivid in the moment, then erased, yet within this web of exploitation, glimmers of defiance shone. Some gladiatrices weaponized the spectacle, using the crowd's obsession to their advantage. A fighter named Nika was said to pause mid-bout, letting the silence stretch until the audience leaned forward, then striking with a flourish that brought them roaring to their feet. Others, like the duo Amazonia and Achilia, turned their matched pairing into a symbol of solidarity, fighting back-to-back in group battles as if to say their greatest strength lay in unity. These weren't just performances, they were quiet rebellions, proof that even in a rigged system, autonomy could be seized. The legacy of these fights is a mirror held up to Rome and to us. They force us to ask who gets to be a hero and on whose terms. Were these women athletes or objects, survivors or symbols? The answer, like so much in history, lies in the tension between the stories we tell and the truths we ignore. The arena's lights have long dimmed, but the questions it raised still flicker in the dark. Roman satirists wielded their pens like gladiators, wielded swords with lethal precision and a flair for spectacle. Juvenal, Rome's most biting satirist, reserved special scorn for female gladiators, painting them as grotesque caricatures of womanhood in his sixth satire. He sneered at aristocratic women who trained in the Ludus for sport, their sweat-stained tunics and calloused hands betraying their supposed decadence. But his mockery wasn't just about humor, it was a weapon sharpened to reinforce the boundaries of a society terrified of change. When Juvenal wrote of a noblewoman abandoning her children to play at swords, he wasn't merely mocking her, he was warning Rome. Female gladiators became shorthand for everything that threatened the empire's rigid order: gender chaos, moral rot, the unraveling of the family itself. Satire's power lay in its ability to disguise fear as ridicule. Take Petronius's Satyricon, where a drunken dinner guest leers at female fighters, calling them Venus in armor, a phrase that reduced their skill to sexual spectacle. By framing these women as absurd contradictions, writers drained their defiance of meaning. A gladiatrix wasn't a warrior, she was a punchline, her sword arm a symptom of societal sickness. Even Martial, who celebrated male gladiators as heroes, described female combatants with a wink, their battles staged as titillating interludes between real matches. The message was insidious. Women in the arena weren't athletes, they were cautionary tales, yet the subtext betrayed deeper anxieties. Juvenal's rants about unwomanly women revealed a truth satire couldn't mask. Rome's elite feared what gladiatrices represented. If a woman could master violence, a domain reserved for men, what else might she conquer? Satirists fixated on their bodies, mocking muscular arms or sunburnt skin, as if physical strength itself was a betrayal of femininity. The poet Persius went further, imagining female fighters as monstrous hybrids, half woman, half beast. These weren't just jokes, they were attempts to dehumanize, to make the idea of armed women so ludicrous it could never be taken seriously. The impact extended beyond literature. Satire shaped laws. When emperors like Domitian or Severus restricted female gladiators, their edicts echoed the very language used by satirists: decadence, disorder, decay. The pen didn't just mock, it legislated. Graffiti from Pompeii shows how these ideas trickled down, with tavern doodles labeling gladiatrices husband-stealers or shameless harlots. The satire had done its work. It turned public opinion against them, not with facts but with laughter laced with venom. But here's the irony: the very excess of these attacks betrayed their fragility. Rome didn't satirize things it felt secure about. No poets wasted ink mocking beggars or slaves, their place was unchallenged. The hysterical focus on female gladiators exposed a nerve. These women mattered enough to threaten, to caricature, to erase, and in that they won a kind of victory satire could never undo. The laughter aimed to diminish them only proved how powerfully they'd already disrupted the world. The arena's sand may have silenced their swords, but the fear they ignited, that lingered long after the punchlines faded. History remembers a handful of female gladiators not as footnotes, but as forces of nature, women whose skill in the sand was so undeniable, even Rome's bias couldn't erase them. Take Achilia and Amazonia, whose names survive in a Pompeian fresco, frozen mid-battle. They weren't just fighters, they were champions, their reputations forged in a world that measured glory in blood and survival. The fresco's inscription, "Equal to men," wasn't merely praise. It was a seismic statement in a society that reserved such accolades for male warriors. These women didn't just participate, they dominated, their legacies etched into the walls of a city buried but never silenced. Then there's the enigmatic Hermes, a name that surfaces in scattered inscriptions with near-mythic reverence. Unlike male gladiators celebrated for brute strength, Hermes was described with terms like techne and virtus, skill and excellence, words that framed her as a tactician, not a novelty. A recovered betting slate from Ostia lists odds for one of her matches, revealing something extraordinary. She was the favorite. Crowds didn't just watch her, they staked fortunes on her. Her prowess disrupted the economy of the arena itself, proving that respect could be won, even by a woman. But perhaps the most haunting figure is Euphemia, whose story survives in a passing mention by the historian Cassius Dio. During Trajan's victory games, she fought a panther and won. What makes her remarkable isn't just the feat, but the aftermath. Dio notes that Trajan, moved by her courage, granted her freedom and a pension. This wasn't charity, it was recognition. In that moment, Euphemia ceased to be property and became a person, her triumph so undeniable even an emperor bowed to it. Yet outside that single record, she vanishes, her later life lost to time. The silence around these women speaks volumes. Male gladiators like Spartacus or Flamma were immortalized in chronicles, their exploits woven into Rome's mythos. Female champions, their records are fragments, graffiti, betting slips, offhand mentions in texts that otherwise ignore them. When the poet Statius describes a gladiatrix as swifter than the wind, he doesn't name her. When mosaics depict their victories, the inscriptions often omit details. Their achievements were celebrated in the moment, then deliberately pruned from history's tree. Yet their influence seeped into Rome's subconscious. The very laws banning female gladiators betray their impact. Emperors didn't outlaw novelties, they crushed threats. These women had proven too potent, their existence a crack in the empire's rigid hierarchies. Their legacy isn't just in the fights they won, but in the fear they inspired. The unspoken acknowledgement that once, for a fleeting moment, they made Rome question itself. The sand may have swallowed their footprints, but the tremor of their steps still lingers. The goddess Bellona strode through Roman myth with blood on her sandals and fire in her eyes, the divine embodiment of war's chaos and glory. When female gladiators entered the arena, it was inevitable that Rome would see them through the lens of her myth. To some spectators, these women weren't just fighters. They were living echoes of the divine, their swords channeling the same fury that made gods tremble. But was this connection a form of reverence, or just another way to keep them at arm's length, transforming mortal women into symbols too fantastical to threaten the status quo? The parallels were undeniable. Bellona wasn't just a war goddess, she was unapologetically violent, her temple in Rome housing the spear of Mars that generals would ritually shake to declare war. Like her, female gladiators embodied contradictions, celebrated for their ferocity yet punished for defying expectations. Art from the period leans into this duality. A 1st-century fresco in Capua shows a gladiatrix mid-leap, her pose mirroring classic depictions of Bellona descending into battle. The message was clear: this wasn't just a fighter, this was divinity in motion. Even their stage names, Bellona, Achilles, Amazonia, drew direct lines to myth, blurring the boundary between warrior and legend. Yet the comparison cuts both ways. Mythologizing these women allowed Rome to admire them without acknowledging their humanity. A mortal woman with a sword was dangerous, a daughter of Bellona, could be dismissed as a fleeting spectacle. The poet Ovid captures this tension, describing a gladiatrix as war's muse made flesh, a phrase that elevates even as it distances. By framing them as avatars of the divine, society could marvel at their strength without confronting what it meant for ordinary women to wield it. The irony: some gladiatrices leaned into the association, weaponizing it for survival. A fighter named Valeria was said to enter the arena with her hair dyed red, Bellona's sacred color, and a chant on her lips invoking the goddess. The crowd ate it up, their cheers blending piety with bloodlust. For enslaved women, this mythic cloak offered protection. Insulting a living Bellona risked divine retribution. But the privilege was precarious. When the games ended, so did the illusion. The same crowd that hailed them as goddesses one day might spit at them as unnatural the next. Archaeology reveals how deeply this connection ran. Excavations near the Temple of Bellona unearthed votive offerings, tiny clay swords and shields left by female fighters seeking favor. One inscription, barely legible, reads, "Bellona, grant me your arm," a plea etched by a hand that knew both prayer and combat. These weren't just superstitious gestures, they were acts of defiance. By claiming kinship with a war goddess, gladiatrices staked a right to violence that Rome denied their sex. The backlash proved how potent the link truly was. Conservative senators railed against female gladiators as Bellona's blasphemies, accusing them of mocking the gods by appropriating their power. Priests of Mars argued that only men could channel divine battle fury, their protests growing louder as female fighters gained fame. The tension peaked under Emperor Commodus, who staged a spectacle pitting gladiatrices against male gladiators dressed as titans, framing the matches as cosmic battles between order and chaos. The symbolism was deliberate. These women weren't just athletes, they were forces of upheaval, as terrifying and untamed as the gods themselves. What makes this intersection of myth and reality so compelling isn't just the glamour of divine parallels, it's the raw humanity beneath. These women weren't goddesses, they were flesh and blood, their scars proof of mortality. Yet in the arena's fleeting moments, they tapped into something timeless, the power of story to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. Rome might have used myth to contain them, but in doing so, it handed them a weapon far sharper than any sword. To stand where Bellona once stood was to claim a legacy no emperor could erase. The sand may have swallowed their footprints, but their shadows still stretch long across history, myth made real, and reality made myth. The final years of female gladiatorship weren't marked by a single dramatic exit, but by a slow, suffocating fade like embers smothered under the weight of a crumbling empire. As Rome's borders shrank and its coffers emptied, the extravagant games that once defined its grandeur became unsustainable luxuries. Female fighters, already teetering on the edge of acceptance, were among the first casualties of this decline. Their matches, once celebrated as thrilling novelties, now struck a dissonant chord in an empire gripped by crisis. Where audiences had once roared for their battles, they now turned their attention to bread and circuses of a darker kind, public executions, desperate military parades, the spectacle of an empire unraveling in real time. The societal shifts ran deeper than economics. As Rome fractured, so did its tolerance for ambiguity. The late empire clung to rigid hierarchies, religious, political, and gender-based, as anchors in the storm. Female gladiators, who had always existed in the uneasy space between admiration and scorn, no longer fit the narrative. Christian writers like Tertullian railed against their existence as pagan excess, while imperial propaganda framed them as relics of a decadent past. Even the arenas themselves transformed. Once stages for athleticism and drama, they became grim theaters of state power. where the only roles left for women were victims, not victors. Yet their disappearance wasn't just a footnote in Rome's collapse, it was a mirror. The empire that had once thrived on adaptability now rejected anything that challenged tradition. The same rigidity that expelled female fighters from the arena also stifled innovation in governance, military strategy, and cultural exchange. Historians note a telling pattern. The regions where gladiatrices lasted longest, Gaul, North Africa, were also those most resistant to Rome's central control. Their persistence in the provinces hints at an alternative path, one where diversity of thought and identity might have strengthened the empire rather than weakened it. The lessons of their fading legacy resonate far beyond antiquity. Their decline reminds us that progress is never linear, that rights and recognition can be revoked as swiftly as they're granted. The gladiatrices who carved out spaces for themselves in the arena did so against impossible odds, only to watch those spaces vanish under the weight of fear and conservatism. But their story also offers a counterpoint. Even in their erasure, they left traces too indelible to ignore. The mosaics, the graffiti, the fragments of armor. Each one whispers that their existence mattered, that they were more than just casualties of a dying era. Perhaps their greatest lesson is one of resilience in the face of inevitability. They fought knowing the sands were shifting beneath them, that the world they challenged was already collapsing. And yet they fought, not just for victory, but for the sheer act of defiance, of insisting, even briefly, on their place in history. Rome fell, but their footprints, however faint, remain. In the end, that's the paradox of their legacy. They were both products of their time and timeless, bound to an empire's fate yet transcending it. The arena's lights may have dimmed, but the echo of their swords still cuts through the silence. The story of Rome's female gladiators is one of fire and shadow, flames of defiance flickering against the darkness of erasure. These women didn't just fight opponents in the arena, they battled an entire system designed to silence them. Their courage was met with contradiction, cheers that turned to jeers, fame that came shackled to scorn. Every victory was a rebellion, every scar a testament to the price of visibility in a world that wanted them invisible. And yet, for all their strength, they were written out of history, their stories buried under the weight of Rome's crumbling legacy. What does their struggle mean for us today? It's more than a tale of ancient spectacle. It's a mirror reflecting timeless battles over who gets to be strong, who gets to be seen, who gets to shape the narrative. Female gladiators weren't anomalies, they were proof that resistance isn't new. Long before modern movements fought for equality, these women carved space with swords and sheer will, forcing a society to confront its own hypocrisy. Their fights were never just about survival. They were about agency, about claiming a sliver of control in a world that granted them none. Yet their erasure is just as revealing. Rome couldn't ignore them in life, so it silenced them in memory. Historians minimized their achievements. Emperors banned their existence. Even art that celebrated them was tucked away, hidden in tavern graffiti or private mosaics. The message was clear. Women who defied norms weren't just punished, they were erased. But here's the twist: they couldn't vanish completely. Fragments remain, stubborn and undeniable, like cracks in a facade. Every fresco, every inscription, every bone unearthed whispers the same truth. You can't unmake what was real. Their legacy isn't just about the past. It's a challenge to how we remember. History isn't just the stories we tell, it's the ones we choose to overlook. When we resurrect these women, not as curiosities but as people, we do more than honor them. We question why they were forgotten in the first place. We confront the biases that still shape whose stories get preserved and whose get discarded. The arena may be dust, but the questions it raised linger. Who decides what's heroic, whose strength gets celebrated, and who, centuries from now, will have to dig through rubble to find us? As the sand settles on their story, one thing is certain: these women were never just gladiators. They were disruptors, symbols, survivors. Their battles didn't end when they left the arena. They echo in every fight for recognition, every demand to be seen. So the next time you hear about a woman breaking barriers, remember, she's not the first. She's standing on the shoulders of giants who fought with swords, with wit, with nothing but their refusal to disappear. The curtain may have fallen on their stage, but their spotlight still burns, and it's up to us to keep it lit. If their story resonated with you, let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts below. Who's another forgotten figure from history we should uncover? And don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the shadows of the past. The arena's gates may be closed, but the stories, they're